The last rays of sunset painted the wooden cross crimson as Yancey Stokes drove the shovel into the unyielding earth one final time. 3 years had passed since he'd buried Rebecca and their unborn child, but the pain remained as fresh as an open wound. Sweat trickled down his weathered face as he placed a single wildflower on the grave before turning back toward his homestead, a lonely silhouette against the vast Arkansas sky of 1879. Fort Smith had seen its share of tragedy, but Yancey carried his like a shadow that never left, not even in the brightest sunlight. At 32, he was neither young enough for foolish hope nor old enough to have made peace with his lot. Each morning he rose before dawn to work his modest cattle ranch outside of town. Each night he returned to an empty house that had once held so much promise. "Another day done," he murmured to his horse, Rogue, as he unsaddled the animal. The gelding nickered softly in response, the only conversation Yancey had most days. His nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and he preferred it that way. People meant questions, and questions meant remembering. Inside his cabin, he lit a lamp and stared at the cold hearth. He'd stopped building evening fires in the summer months. What was the point of warmth when there was no one to share it? He sliced bread and cheese for his dinner, washing it down with coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Some men in his position might have turned to whiskey, but Yancey had seen what the bottle did to his father. He'd sooner die sober and in pain than drunk and unfeeling. The next morning broke hot and clear. Yancey had 50 acres to irrigate before the week's end, and a broken fence line to repair where his cattle had pushed through. Hard work was his salvation, the only thing that dulled the edges of his grief. He loaded his tools into the wagon and headed out to the north pasture, Rogue pulling steadily as the sun climbed higher. By midday, sweat soaked his shirt as he hammered a post into place. The sound of an approaching wagon made him pause. Visitors were rare and rarely welcome. He squinted against the sunlight to see a smaller wagon coming down the road toward his property, driven by someone he didn't recognize. As the wagon drew closer, Yancey realized it was a woman holding the reins. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a bonnet, but wisps had escaped to frame a face both delicate and determined. Beside her sat a young boy of perhaps 8 or 9, watching Yancey with undisguised curiosity. "Pardon me," she called out, pulling her team to a stop. "I'm looking for the Harper place." "I was told it was just beyond yours." Yancey leaned on his hammer. "You've passed it. It's about a mile back, the turnoff with the lightning-struck oak." "Oh," she frowned, glancing back down the road. "I must have missed it. Easy enough to do if you're not familiar with these parts." Yancey studied her more carefully. Her clothes were good quality but well worn. The wagon contained furniture and crates. Clearly, she wasn't just visiting. "You're the new owner." "Yes, I'm Tabitha Lawson. This is my son, James." The boy nodded solemnly. "My husband's cousin left us the property in his will. We've come from St. Louis to make a fresh start." "Widow." The word hung unspoken between them. Yancey nodded, understanding more than she knew. "It's been vacant for nearly 2 years," he said. "Might need some work before it's proper habitable." "We're prepared for that." Something in her tone suggested she was prepared for much more than a few repairs. "Thank you for your directions, Mr. Stokes." "Yancey Stokes." "Thank you, Mr. Stokes. We'll leave you to your work." As she turned the wagon around, the boy continued to stare at Yancey with solemn eyes. Yancey raised a hand in awkward farewell, then returned to his fence post. He told himself it didn't matter who lived at the Harper place. Neighbors or no neighbors, his days would follow the same pattern they always had. Yet that night, as he sat in his dark cabin, he found himself wondering what condition the Harper house was in. Old man Harper had been a decent sort, but not much for maintenance. The widow and her boy might be facing more work than they bargained for. It wasn't his concern. He had his own land to work, his own problems to solve. Fort Smith had plenty of able-bodied men who could help a widow settle in, men who hadn't forgotten how to be sociable. 3 days later, Yancey was in town picking up supplies when he overheard a conversation between the mercantile owner, Gus Peterson, and another customer. "That poor woman and her boy trying to make a go of that ramshackle place," Peterson was saying. "Roof's halfway gone and the well pump seized up tight. She's got more determination than sense, if you ask me." "She hiring help?" the other man asked. "Says she can't afford it, been trying to do the repairs herself." Peterson shook his head. "Won't last a month out there once winter comes if she doesn't get that roof fixed." Yancey loaded his supplies without comment, but the conversation nagged at him all the way home. The Harper place was the closest property to his. If the widow and her boy failed and left, someone else would move in eventually. Someone who might not respect boundaries, who might let their cattle roam onto his grazing land, who might be the sociable type that expected neighborly visits. "Better the devil you know," his father used to say. The next morning, Yancey found himself loading extra lumber into his wagon. He told himself it was because he needed to reinforce his barn anyway, and might have some leftover. It wasn't until he was halfway to the Harper place that he admitted to himself what he was doing. The property came into view as he rounded the bend. It was in worse shape than he remembered. The house, once a respectable 2-story structure, now sagged on one side where the foundation had settled. Weeds had overtaken the yard and the barn door hung from a single hinge. Tabitha Lawson stood on a ladder against the house, attempting to nail shingles onto the roof. Her movements were clumsy but determined. The boy, James, stood below, handing up supplies when she called for them. Yancey halted his wagon near the house. For a moment, he considered turning around. This wasn't his problem. But then the ladder wobbled dangerously as Tabitha stretched to reach a section of the roof. "Madam," he called out, climbing down from his wagon, "that ladder isn't set right." She glanced down, surprise evident on her face. "Mr. Stokes, you're going to break your neck up there." He approached the ladder and steadied it with one hand. "That's not how you replace shingles either. You're leaving gaps where the water will get in." Her cheeks flushed, either from the heat or embarrassment. "I'm doing the best I can with what I know." Yancey sighed, already regretting his decision to stop. "Come on down. I've got some lumber that might help, and I can show you the proper way to shingle a roof." She hesitated, pride warring with practicality on her face. Finally, she descended the ladder with careful steps. Up close, Yancey could see the exhaustion in her eyes, though she held herself with dignity. Her hands were blistered and raw from unaccustomed labor. "I don't have much money to pay you," she said directly. "I'm not asking for payment." Yancey removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "Just being neighborly. Neighborly." She repeated the word as if testing its truth. "Very well. I accept your help, Mr. Stokes." James had been watching this exchange with interest. "Can I help too?" he asked, his voice eager. Yancey glanced at the boy, noting his thin frame but determined expression. "Sure, son. You can start by helping me unload that lumber." The day passed in steady work. Yancey found himself explaining each step as he went, showing James how to measure twice and cut once, demonstrating to Tabitha how to identify rotted wood that needed replacing. They worked until the sun began to set, managing to repair the worst section of the roof. "That should keep the rain out of your bedroom at least," Yancey said as he packed up his tools. "The rest will have to wait for tomorrow." Tabitha looked startled. "You're coming back tomorrow?" He hadn't planned to, but looking at the amount of work still to be done, and the determined set of her jaw as she'd worked alongside him all day, he found himself nodding. If that's acceptable. More than acceptable. She hesitated, then added, "Would you stay for supper?" "It's just beans and corn bread, but it's the least I can offer." His first instinct was to refuse. He hadn't taken a meal with anyone in years. But the smell of bread baking had been wafting from the house for the past hour, and his stomach reminded him that his own dinner would be cold and solitary. "Thank you. That would be fine." Inside, the house was sparsely furnished but scrupulously clean. Tabitha had clearly been working to make it habitable despite the structural problems. James proudly showed Yancey a chair he had helped sand and repair, as Tabitha set the table with simple but well-kept dishes. The meal was simple but tasty. Yancey found himself eating seconds, then thirds of the cornbread, which was better than anything he'd made for himself in years. "This is good," he said, realizing how inadequate the words were. "Thank you." Tabitha smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "It was my mother's recipe. My ma taught Mom to make it," James added, "before she died." An awkward silence fell. Yancey stared at his plate, the familiar pain rising like bile in his throat at the mention of death. "James, that's enough chatter," Tabitha said quietly. "Mr. Stokes doesn't need to hear our family history." "It's fine," Yancey said, though it wasn't. "I lost someone too, my wife, Rebecca, 3 years ago." He hadn't meant to say it. The words had simply escaped, perhaps loosened by the unfamiliar comfort of a home-cooked meal and company. Tabitha's eyes met his, recognition and understanding passing between them. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Stokes." "Yancey," he said, "if we're going to be working together, you might as well use my given name." "Yancey," she repeated, "and I'm Tabitha, not Mrs. Lawson or Madam." James looked between them, a child's curiosity on his face. "Did you have any children, Mr. Yancey, James?" Tabitha's voice was sharp with embarrassment. "That's not a proper question." Yancey set down his fork. "No, it's all right. No, James, I didn't have any children. My wife was expecting when she died. Fever took them both." The boy's eyes widened. "I'm sorry. My pa died from fever too last winter." "I think that's enough talk of sad things for one evening," Tabitha said firmly. "James, help me clear the table." As they worked, Yancey found himself studying them. The boy had his mother's dark hair and determined chin, but his eyes were a different color hazel where hers were deep brown. He moved with the energy of youth but showed unusual care with the dishes, obviously aware of their value to his mother. Tabitha herself was a study in contrasts. Her hands were work-roughened but her movements graceful. She spoke with the education of a city woman but tackled rural challenges with stubborn determination. She wasn't classically beautiful, but there was something compelling about her face, especially when she smiled. It had been a long time since Yancey had noticed such things about a woman. The realization made him uncomfortable. "I should be heading back," he said abruptly, standing. "Thank you for the meal." "Thank you for the help with the roof," Tabitha replied. "What time should we expect you tomorrow? I've got my own chores to tend to first, probably mid-morning." He hesitated, then added, "There's a storm coming in a few days. We should prioritize finishing the roof." "We will be ready to work when you arrive," she said, walking him to the door. In the doorway, she added, "Yancey, I know what it costs to open old wounds by speaking of them. Thank you for your honesty with James. He's been trying to understand loss." Yancey nodded uncomfortably. "Good night, Tabitha." As he drove home through the gathering darkness, Yancey told himself this was a temporary arrangement. He would help get the Harper place, the Lawson place now, into habitable condition before winter, and then return to his solitary existence. It was the neighborly thing to do, nothing more. Yet for the first time in 3 years, he built a fire in his hearth that night, though the evening was warm enough without it. The next few days fell into a pattern. Yancey would arrive at the Lawson place by mid-morning, having completed his essential chores at his own ranch. James would run out to greet him, eager to learn new skills. Tabitha would be already working, her determination never flagging despite the enormity of the task before them. Together, they repaired the roof, fixed the well pump, and reinforced the sagging foundation. Yancey found himself explaining techniques his own father had taught him, knowledge he'd never expected to pass on. James absorbed everything with keen interest, asking intelligent questions and showing surprising strength for his age. Each evening, Tabitha would insist Yancey stay for supper. Each evening, he would accept with less reluctance than the day before. The meals were simple but satisfying, and the conversation easier than he would have thought possible. He learned that Tabitha had been a schoolteacher in St. Louis before her marriage, that James loved to read but struggled with numbers, that her husband, William, had been a clerk for a shipping company, a good man but not particularly practical with his hands, that they had come west not just because of the inherited property, but because St. Louis held too many memories. In turn, he found himself sharing pieces of his own life. How he'd built his ranch from nearly nothing after leaving his father's failing farm. How Rebecca had been the daughter of the local banker, who had disapproved of their marriage but couldn't deny his daughter's choice. How they'd had 2 good years before the fever came through Fort Smith and took her. "Did you never consider remarrying?" Tabitha asked one evening as they sat on the newly repaired porch, watching James chase fireflies in the yard. Yancey stared into the gathering darkness. "Never found a reason to consider it. Loneliness isn't reason enough. Being lonely doesn't mean you need company." He regretted the words as soon as they left his mouth. "I didn't mean, no, I understand." Tabitha's voice was soft. "After William died, people were quick to suggest I find another husband, as if that would solve everything, as if he could be replaced like a broken wheel on a wagon." Yancey nodded, relieved she hadn't taken offense. "Exactly. But a wheel can be replaced," she continued, "and the wagon still rolls. It's not the same wheel, but it serves its purpose. Perhaps the heart can learn to love differently without diminishing what came before." Her words unsettled him. He stood abruptly. "It's getting late. I should head back." If she was disappointed by his reaction, she didn't show it. "Of course. Thank you again for all your help today." The storm Yancey had predicted arrived the following afternoon with a vengeance. He and Tabitha had just finished the last section of the roof when the first rumbles of thunder sounded. They hurried inside as the sky opened, rain lashing against the newly repaired shingles. "Will it hold?" Tabitha asked anxiously, looking up at the ceiling. "It'll hold," Yancey assured her, though privately he worried about the western corner where the wood had been particularly rotted. They'd done their best with the materials at hand, but a deluge like this would find any weakness. James pressed his face to the window, watching the lightning with fascination rather than fear. "It's like the sky is breaking apart." "Stay back from the window, son," Yancey said automatically, then caught himself. It wasn't his place to parent the boy, but Tabitha nodded in agreement. "Yancey's right, James. Come away from there." The storm raged for hours. When it became clear Yancey couldn't safely return home, Tabitha insisted he stay the night. "You can take the spare room," she said. "It's small, but it's dry." "I can sleep in the barn," he protested. "Don't be foolish. The barn roof isn't fully repaired yet." Her tone brooked no argument. "I won't have you catching your death of pneumonia when there's a perfectly good bed available." The spare room turned out to be little more than a storage space with a narrow cot, but it was indeed dry and comfortable enough. Yancey lay awake listening to the storm, acutely aware of Tabitha and James sleeping just down the hall. It had been years since he'd spent the night under the same roof as other people. The sensation was both foreign and oddly comforting. Around midnight, a particularly violent thunderclap shook the house. Moments later, Yancey heard the telltale sound of water dripping. He got up quickly and followed the sound to James's room, where rain was indeed coming through the ceiling in the western corner he'd worried about. James was sitting up in bed, watching the growing puddle on the floor. "I think the roof is leaking, Mr. Yancey." "So it is." Yancey grabbed an empty basin from the washstand and placed it under the drip. "Looks like we didn't get that corner quite right." Tabitha appeared in the doorway, her hair loose around her shoulders and a shawl wrapped hastily over her nightgown. "What's happening?" "Just a small leak," Yancey explained, acutely aware of her state of undress and his own. He was still fully clothed, having slept in his pants and shirt, but the intimacy of the midnight situation struck him forcefully. "I've put a basin under it for now. We can fix it properly once the storm passes." "Is it safe?" Tabitha moved to James's side, putting a protective arm around him. "Perfectly safe," Yancey assured her. "It's just a small leak, not a structural problem." He hesitated, then added, "James can take my cot if you're worried. I can sleep in a chair." "Don't be silly," Tabitha said. "James can share my room for tonight. There's plenty of space." The boy gathered his blanket and pillow, then paused at the door. "Thank you for fixing the leak, Mr. Yancey." "You're welcome, James. Sleep well." After they'd gone, Yancey remained in the room a moment longer, watching the steady drip into the basin. Something about the domestic scene, a midnight leak, a concerned mother, a curious child stirred emotions he'd thought long buried. He'd once dreamed of such moments with Rebecca and their child, the simple problems of family life that would have been joys to solve together. He returned to his cot but found sleep elusive. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a freshly washed world and a strange hollowness in Yancey's chest. Over breakfast, they discussed the repairs needed for the leak. Yancey found himself promising to return the next day and the day after if necessary. "You've already done so much," Tabitha protested. "You must have your own ranch to tend to." "My cattle won't suffer for a few more days of divided attention," he said. In truth, he'd been neglecting certain tasks, but nothing that couldn't wait. "Besides, we can't leave that corner unfinished with more weather coming." James looked up eagerly. "Can I help fix it too?" "Of course," Yancey replied before thinking. "Every good ranch hand needs to know how to patch a roof." "I'm going to be a ranch hand when I grow up," James announced, "just like Mr. Yancey." Tabitha's eyes met Yancey's over the boy's head, a mixture of gratitude and something else, wariness perhaps, in her expression. "James has been city-raised until now. This is all quite new and exciting for him." "City life has its advantages," Yancey said carefully. "More opportunities for education, for one." "Mom was a teacher," James said proudly. "She knows everything about books." "Not everything," Tabitha laughed. "But I do plan to continue James's education here. I've written to the school board in Fort Smith about a teaching position, but in the meantime, we'll have lessons at home." Yancey nodded. "A smart young man like James needs proper schooling. My Rebecca was keen on education too. She taught me to appreciate Shakespeare and poetry, things I'd never had much time for growing up." It was the first time he'd mentioned Rebecca without pain being the primary emotion. The realization startled him. The work on the leak took most of the day but was successful. As the sun began to set, Yancey found himself reluctant to leave, inventing small tasks to complete before he finally ran out of excuses to stay. You could come for supper tomorrow instead of working, Tabitha suggested as he prepared to depart, to celebrate having a completely waterproof roof. The invitation caught him off guard. I wouldn't want to impose when there's no work to be done. It's not an imposition, it's a thank you. Her eyes held his steadily. Unless you'd rather not. No, I'd like that, he found himself saying. Thank you. The next day, Yancey spent more time than usual on his appearance before riding over to the Lawson place. He trimmed his beard, put on a clean shirt, and even polished his boots, actions that would have seemed pointless just weeks before. When he arrived, he was surprised to find the yard tidied, with wildflowers arranged in a jar on the porch. Inside, the table was set with what he recognized as Tabitha's best dishes, and the aroma of roasting meat filled the house. You didn't need to go to such trouble, he said, suddenly self-conscious. It's no trouble, Tabitha replied, though a faint blush suggested otherwise. James and I wanted to do something special to thank you. I shot a rabbit, James announced proudly. Mr. Peterson from town showed me how to use a snare, and we caught it this morning. That's very impressive, Yancey said, genuinely surprised. You're learning fast for a city boy. The meal was the best Yancey had eaten in years, rabbit stewed with wild onions, and the last of the summer carrots, fresh bread, and blackberry cobbler for dessert. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by James's excited accounts of his new rural skills and plans for future adventures. As the evening wore on, James began to nod off at the table. Tabitha gently sent him to bed, leaving her and Yancey alone. A strange tension filled the air between them. Yancey stared into his coffee cup, searching for something to say that wouldn't reveal the confusion in his heart. I should be going, he said finally, of course. Tabitha stood and began clearing the dishes. You must have an early start tomorrow, Tabitha. Her name felt right on his tongue. Thank you for tonight, for everything. She paused, a dish in her hands. You're the one who's done so much for us. I don't know how we would have managed without your help. You would have managed, he said with certainty. You're the most determined woman I've ever met. Is that a compliment or a criticism? Her tone was light, but her eyes were serious. Definitely a compliment. He stood, moving closer to her. I admire your strength. Coming out here alone with James, taking on this place, it takes courage. Sometimes courage is simply having no other choice. She set the dish down carefully. After William died, staying in St. Louis wasn't an option. We needed a fresh start, somewhere we could build something of our own. And you're doing it. That's something to be proud of. They were standing very close now. Yancey could smell the lavender soap she used, see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, evidence of both laughter and sorrow in her 30 years. Will you come again? She asked quietly. Even though the repairs are finished. The question hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond simple neighborliness. Yancey knew his answer would set a course he hadn't planned for, perhaps wasn't ready for. Yes, he said finally. I'd like that. The smile that illuminated her face was worth any uncertainty he felt. Good. James would miss you terribly if you disappeared from our lives. Only James. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Tabitha's gaze didn't waver. No, not only James. He wanted to kiss her then, to bridge the final distance between them. But something held him back, respect for her position, fear of his own feelings, the ghost of Rebecca that still haunted his heart. Instead, he took her hand briefly, the touch electric even in its innocence. Good night, Tabitha. Good night, Yancey. As autumn progressed, Yancey found himself spending more and more time at the Lawson place. There were always tasks that needed doing: wood to chop for the coming winter, vegetables to harvest from the small garden they'd planted, preparations to make for the livestock Tabitha hoped to acquire in the spring. But increasingly, his visits had little to do with practical matters. He came for Sunday dinners, for evenings reading by the fire while James practiced his letters, for moments alone with Tabitha after the boy was asleep, when they would talk about everything and nothing, their pasts, their present circumstances, their tentative hopes for the future. He taught James to ride properly on an elderly mare he brought over from his own ranch, to whittle simple figures from wood, to recognize animal tracks in the forest. The boy soaked up knowledge like parched earth absorbs rain, his city manners gradually giving way to the confident bearing of a young man at home in rural surroundings. Tabitha secured a position teaching 3 days a week at the Fort Smith School, riding in on Yancey's mare and returning by evening. On the days she taught, Yancey would often check on James, who was old enough to stay alone but appreciated the company and the chance to help with man's work, as he called it. In town, people began to notice. Yancey, who had been nearly a hermit since Rebecca's death, was seen accompanying the Lawson widow and her son to church services, carrying their packages after shopping, even smiling occasionally. "Never thought I'd see the day," Gus Peterson remarked one afternoon when Yancey was picking up supplies. "You're looking like a man with purpose again." Yancey shrugged uncomfortably. "Just being neighborly." "If that's what they're calling it these days," Peterson chuckled. "Well, she's a fine woman and that boy needs a father figure. It's good to see you rejoining the land of the living, Stokes." Yancey said nothing, but the words followed him home. Was that what he was doing, rejoining life? And if so, was he betraying Rebecca's memory in the process? That night he found himself at her grave, the first visit in nearly a month. The realization shamed him. He'd come every week without fail for 3 years, and now he'd let weeks pass without a thought. "I don't know what I'm doing, Beck," he said into the darkness. "This wasn't the plan." "You were the plan, you and our child and our life together." The night offered no answer but the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Yancey knelt beside the grave, tracing the letters of Rebecca's name on the wooden cross. "She makes me feel alive again," he confessed. "She and James both. And I'm scared of what that means, scared that loving them somehow diminishes what we had." A gentle breeze stirred the prairie grass around the grave. Yancey closed his eyes, remembering Rebecca as she'd been in life, vibrant, kind, always encouraging him to open his heart wider, to embrace the world more fully. "You'd like her," he said finally. "You tell me I'm being a fool for hesitating. You never did have patience for my brooding." The thought brought a smile to his lips, bittersweet but genuine. Perhaps this was what healing felt like, not forgetting, but making room for new joy alongside the precious memories. When the first snow fell in late November, Yancey arrived at the Lawson place to find Tabitha attempting to chop wood, her hands red with cold and her movements hampered by her heavy coat. "Let me do that," he said, taking the axe from her hands. "I'm perfectly capable," she protested, but relinquished the tool without much argument. "Never said you weren't. But there's no sense in both of us knowing how to chop wood when there are other tasks that need doing." She laughed at that, a sound that had become increasingly common as the weeks passed. "Very practical, Mr. Stokes. And what other tasks would you suggest for me?" "Well, no one makes coffee like you do." He began splitting logs with efficient strokes. "And I happen to know James has torn his coat sleeve again. Seems like mending might be a better use of your talents than freezing out here. Is this your subtle way of suggesting women's work and men's work?" There was an edge to her voice that made him pause. "No," he said carefully. "It's my not-so-subtle way of saying I'm better at chopping wood than you are, and you're better at mending than I am. Fair division of labor has nothing to do with being a man or a woman. She studied him for a moment, then smiled. Very diplomatic answer, Yancey. Wasn't trying to be diplomatic. Just truthful. He returned to his chopping. If it makes you feel better, you're a far better teacher than I could ever be. James's reading has improved tremendously since you started working with him regularly. He's a bright boy. Pride softened her features. He wants to make you proud, you know. He talks about you constantly. The words warmed Yancey more than he cared to admit. He's a good kid. You've done well with him. We've done well with him, she corrected quietly. These past months having you in his life, it's made all the difference. Yancey set down the axe, suddenly needing to say what had been on his mind since his visit to Rebecca's grave. Tabitha, I need to ask you something. She must have heard the seriousness in his tone because her expression grew cautious. What is it? This thing between us, he gestured vaguely. What do you want from it? From me? The directness of the question seemed to surprise her. She looked away, watching the snow fall softly around them. I want whatever you're willing to give, she said finally. I didn't come here looking for this. For you. But now that I've found you, I find myself hoping for more than just neighborly assistance. I'm not the man I was before Rebecca died, he said honestly. I don't know if I can ever be that man again, the one who believed in forever, who took joy for granted. I'm not asking you to be that man. She stepped closer, her eyes intent on his. I'm not the woman I was before William died either. We've both been shaped by our losses, Yancey. The question isn't whether we can be who we were before, but whether who we are now can build something meaningful together. Her words struck him with their simple truth. I care for you, he admitted. For you and for James, more than I thought possible after Rebecca. But I'm afraid of failing you both. Why would you fail us? Because grief changes a person. Because I've lived alone with my pain for so long I'm not sure I remember how to share a life properly. Then we'll learn together, she said simply, day by day, if that's what you want. The answer rose from his heart, unexpected but undeniable. It is what I want. The distance between them vanished as Yancey pulled her into his arms. Their first kiss was tentative, a question and an answer wrapped in one gentle moment. When they parted, Tabitha's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I never thought I'd feel this way again, she whispered. Neither did I, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. The sound of the door opening broke the moment. James stood on the porch, eyes wide at the scene before him. Are you and Mom going to get married? He asked with a child's directness. Tabitha's embarrassed laugh mingled with Yancey's surprised cough. James, that's not, would you mind if we did? Yancey asked, surprising himself with the question. Someday, I mean. The boy considered this seriously. No, I wouldn't mind. But does that mean I'd have to call you Pa? You can call me whatever feels right to you, Yancey said, meeting Tabitha's stunned gaze over the boy's head. We don't need to rush anything. Okay. James seemed satisfied with this answer. Mom says dinner's almost ready and my hands are clean already, so I'm ahead of both of you. As James disappeared back into the house, Tabitha turned to Yancey, wonder and confusion warring on her face. Did you just propose to me while chopping wood in the snow? Yancey ran a hand through his hair, suddenly self-conscious. I think I might have. Not very romantic, was it? On the contrary. She took his hand, her touch warm despite the cold air. I think it was perfectly us. Is that a yes, then? His heart hammered against his ribs, fear and hope intermingled. It's a ask me properly when you're ready and you might be surprised by my answer. She squeezed his hand. We have time, Yancey. Let's not rush this precious thing we're building. He nodded, relief and disappointment battling within him. She was right, of course. They had been in each other's lives for barely 4 months. There was no need to hurry, especially with James's feelings to consider. That evening, as they sat around the fire after dinner, Yancey found himself studying the tableau before him, James on the floor with his book, Tabitha in her rocking chair with her mending, the hearth casting golden light over the scene. It was domestic, ordinary, and utterly miraculous to a man who had lived with only shadows for company for so long. The winter progressed with its own rhythm. Snowstorms came and went, leaving the landscape transformed into crystalline beauty before melting into muddy paths. Christmas approached, bringing with it preparations that Yancey had ignored for years, but now found himself participating in with unexpected enthusiasm. He helped James cut a small pine tree from the edge of his property, showing him how to secure it in a bucket of sand so it would stand straight. Together with Tabitha, they made simple ornaments from pine cones, dried berries, and scraps of fabric. "We always had a store-bought angel on top of our tree in St. Louis," James told him as they worked. "It was made of porcelain with real feathers for wings." "That sounds mighty fancy," Yancey replied. "We'll have to make do with something simpler this year." "I like this better," the boy said decisively. "When you buy things, you don't get to make them special yourself." Yancey ruffled his hair, a gesture that had become natural over the months. "That's a wise observation, James." On Christmas Eve, after James had finally fallen asleep in anticipation of the morning's modest gifts, Yancey and Tabitha sat alone by the fire. Outside, snow fell in gentle flurries, insulating the house in peaceful silence. "I have something for you," Yancey said, reaching into his pocket. "I wanted to give it to you privately." He handed her a small wooden box, carved with intricate patterns of leaves and flowers. It had taken him weeks of evening work to complete, his hands remembering skills long unused. Tabitha traced the carvings with her finger. "It's beautiful, Yancey." "Open it," he urged. Inside, nestled on a scrap of velvet, lay a ring. It was simple, a band of silver with a small pearl set in the center, but it caught the firelight with gentle luminescence. "It was my mother's," Yancey explained. "The only thing of value she left behind when she died. My father gave it to me when I married Rebecca, but it wasn't her style. She had a proper diamond from her father." He swallowed hard. "I've kept it all these years, not knowing what would become of it. Now I know." Tabitha looked from the ring to his face, her eyes bright with emotion. "Yancey, are you sure? More sure than I've been of anything in a very long time." He took her hand in his. "Tabitha Lawson, I know we agreed not to rush, and if you think it's too soon, I'll understand. But I love you. I love James. I want us to be a family officially, properly." Tears spilled onto her cheeks. "When did you know that you loved me?" "I think I've known since the day of that first storm, when I saw you in the doorway with your hair down and realized I wanted to see you that way every day for the rest of my life." He brushed a tear from her cheek. "But I was too stubborn to admit it, even to myself." "And Rebecca?" She asked softly. "What about her memory?" "I'll always love Rebecca," he said honestly. "She'll always be part of who I am, but she would want me to live to love again. It took me a long time to understand that, but I do now." He squeezed her hand. "If William came to you in a dream tonight and could speak to you one last time, what would he want for you?" Tabitha closed her eyes, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "He would want me to be happy," she said finally. "To find security for James and myself. To build a good life. Then honor him by doing exactly that," Yancey said gently. She opened the box again, looking at the pearl ring. "It's perfect, Yancey. Simple and true, like what we've found together." She held out her left hand. "Will you put it on?" With fingers that trembled slightly, Yancey slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her. "Is that a yes, then?" "It's a yes." She leaned forward to kiss him, her lips warm and certain against his. "Yes to being your wife, to making a home with you, to building our family together." Yancey gathered her in his arms, the weight of years of loneliness finally lifting from his shoulders. In the hearth, the fire crackled with warmth and light, a symbol of the life they would share, not without its challenges or sorrows, but rich with love and purpose. They were married in early spring, when the first wildflowers had begun to carpet the prairie. The ceremony was small, held in the Fort Smith Church with only a handful of witnesses: Gus Peterson and his wife, the local doctor who had become a friend, Tabitha's fellow teacher from the school, and of course James, beaming with pride as he stood beside them. Afterward, they gathered at the Lawson place, soon to be sold, as they had decided to make Yancey's larger ranch their home for a celebratory meal. As the guests chatted and James showed off his reading skills to an appreciative audience, Yancey found a moment alone with his new wife. "Happy?" he asked simply. Tabitha's smile was radiant. "Completely, and you?" "More than I ever thought possible again." He took her hand, his thumb brushing over the pearl ring that now had a simple gold band beside it. "You lit up the darkness, Tabitha, you and James both." "We found each other when we needed it most," she said. "Some might call that luck. I call it providence." Yancey nodded, thinking of all the small decisions that had led to this moment: Tabitha's inheritance of the Harper place, his impulsive decision to help with repairs, a leaky roof during a thunderstorm, conversations by firelight that had slowly healed two wounded hearts. "I have something to tell you," Tabitha said, her voice dropping to ensure privacy. "I wasn't sure until yesterday, but now I am." "What is it?" Concern flickered through him at her serious tone. "In about 7 months, James is going to have a little brother or sister." Her eyes searched his face for his reaction. "I know we hadn't planned on this happening so soon," but Yancey's whoop of joy interrupted her, drawing startled looks from their guests. He lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace, heedless of propriety. "Careful." She laughed as he set her down. "There's precious cargo aboard now." "A baby," he said wonderingly, placing a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Our baby," she confirmed, covering his hand with hers. "Are you truly pleased?" "It won't be easy with the ranch to run, and I have never been more pleased about anything in my life," he assured her. "Except perhaps the day you agreed to be my wife." James approached them, curious about the commotion. "What's happening? Why did Yancey yell?" Tabitha exchanged a glance with Yancey, who nodded encouragingly. "James, how would you feel about being a big brother?" The boy's eyes widened. "You're having a baby." For real," Yancey confirmed. "But not for a while yet. We'll need your help preparing for the little one's arrival." James considered this seriously. "I could teach the baby all sorts of things, like how to fish and identify bird calls and raid." "You'd be an excellent teacher," Tabitha assured him, "just like you've been an excellent son." As their guests began to notice the intimate family conference and surmise its nature, congratulations and well wishes filled the room. Yancey accepted them with a full heart, his arm secure around Tabitha's waist, his other hand resting lightly on James's shoulder. Later that night, after the guests had departed and James had finally succumbed to sleep after the excitement of the day, Yancey and Tabitha stood on the porch of what had been her home and would soon belong to another family making a fresh start. "Are you sad to leave this place?" Yancey asked. "It was your new beginning. It served its purpose," Tabitha said, leaning against him. "It brought me to Fort Smith, to a new life, to you." She looked out at the star-filled sky. "But home isn't about the building, it's about the people you share it with." Yancey nodded, understanding completely. "I felt that the first time I sat at your table. My house stopped being a home when Rebecca died. It was just a place I existed, worked, slept. You brought the meaning back. And now we'll make our home together at your ranch, she said. Our ranch. Our ranch, he agreed. With plenty of room for James to run and our baby to grow and maybe even more little ones down the line if we're so blessed. Tabitha's laugh was soft in the darkness. Let's see how we manage with this one first. They rode back to the ranch under a canopy of stars, James asleep between them in the wagon, exhausted from the day's celebrations. As they approached the house larger than Tabitha's, but in need of a woman's touch, Yancey felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. The past would always be part of them, both the joys and sorrows that had shaped them into the people they'd become. But the future stretched before them now, bright with promise and shared purpose. No longer would he work the land by day and bury his grief by night. Instead, he would build a legacy of love with the family that had found him when he least expected it, but most needed it. As they entered the house together, Yancey lit the lamp, and then, with deliberate care, built a fire in the hearth that had too often remained cold and empty. The flames caught and grew, casting golden light throughout the room, transforming the simple space into something sacred. "Welcome home," he said softly, gathering his new family close. In the years that followed, the Stokes ranch flourished under their combined efforts. Tabitha's daughter, Elizabeth, was born on a crisp autumn morning, followed 2 years later by a son they named Samuel. James grew into a thoughtful young man with his mother's intelligence and Yancey's practical skills, eventually attending college in Denver before returning to help run the expanding ranch operations. Fort Smith changed too, growing from a frontier outpost into a proper town with a larger school where Tabitha continued to teach part-time, instilling a love of learning in generations of children. Yancey served on the town council, helping guide the community's development with the same care he applied to his own land. They weathered droughts and blizzards, market fluctuations and personal sorrows, including the peaceful passing of Old Rogue and the more wrenching loss of Tabitha's father, who had finally come to visit from St. Louis only to fall ill during his stay. Through it all, the bond between them only strengthened, tempered by challenges rather than broken by them. Each year on the anniversary of Rebecca's death, Yancey would visit her grave, sometimes alone, sometimes with Tabitha beside him. They would leave wildflowers and spend a moment in quiet reflection before returning to the bustling life that awaited them at the ranch. It was a ritual of respect and remembrance, acknowledging the past while embracing the present. And each Christmas Eve, after the children were asleep and the gifts arranged beneath the tree, Yancey and Tabitha would sit before the fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, and marvel at the journey that had brought them together, a grieving cowboy and a determined widow, each broken in their own way, who had found wholeness together in the vast promise of the western frontier.